Few Christians are willing to admit that the books we have in the Bible were not written for hundreds of years after Jesus' crucifixion. That is because they were copied and heavily altered from an earlier manuscript, which scholars call Q.
The last books of the Bible to be written were all done within 60 years after Jesus' crucifixion. Even if we're going by skeptical dates, we're still getting the first gospel within 40 years. And Paul is writing easily within 15 years of Jesus' death. I fall into a camp that has a good portion of growing scholarship on its side that dates the Gospel of Mark even earlier, well within a couple of decades of the crucifixion. Saying that the books of the Bible weren't written for hundreds of years after Jesus' crucifixion is simply unscholarly absurdity. It's nonsense for the simple reason that we have copies of the New Testament books. If we take a late dating of John's Gospel being written, somewhere in the 90s AD, in the city of Ephesus, then copies like P52, P66, and P45 date very comfortably within decades of that. And these copies wind up in Egypt. We have to allow for the original to be written, read, passed around, copied, and then travel a near 1,700 miles to locations like Alexandria and Oxyrhynchus, where they end up and we discover them. This all happens well within the window of 15 to 100 years after the ink of John's Gospel dries. Scholars do not refer to Q as an earlier manuscript. Q is an abbreviation of the German word Quelle, which means source. It refers to the fact that the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have a recognized level of literary dependency. While Matthew and Luke share material with Mark, Q is a hypothetical saying source to explain why Matthew and Luke share some material with one another that is not found in Mark. Q, if it ever existed, could well have been an oral, not written source, and many scholars believe that the Q source hypothesis is unnecessary if we simply ascribe the double tradition material to being original to Matthew.
The four canonical Gospels contain countless blatant and irreconcilable contradictions on basic facts about biblical events.
This is a strong assertion, but it's not one that's backed up by the facts. The Gospels tell many of the same stories, but capitalize on different details of those stories in order to focus on a particular aspect of Jesus' ministry. This is exactly what we as historians expect with multiple lines of attested independent sources, and actually testifies to eyewitness testimony of a particular event. An accusation of contradiction needs to be substantiated with clear examples and details that violate the law of non-contradiction. No clear examples here are given. Simply an assertion that they exist is made. But assertions do not equal evidence, and with no evidence of said assertions given, the accusation can be dismissed.
If someone wanted to make their writing known or alter a famous passage to fit their viewpoint, they would not put their own name on it, but the name of a famous person, such as the Gospel of Mark.
This is actually a really good point, and authorial appropriation is exactly what we see being done between the 2nd and 4th centuries with apocryphal material like the ahistorical Gospels of Peter, Philip, Mary, and Thomas. However, the example of Mark seems like a very unusual one to pick on. Mark was not an immediate disciple of Jesus, nor was he a famous character within the earliest Jesus community. In fact, if we can pinpoint who Mark was and might be, the closest example is the traveling companion of Paul and Barnabas named Mark in the book of Acts. But this Mark is specifically mentioned as someone who does not only have conflict with the apostle Paul, but actually abandoned him. So if you're going to falsely call your gospel after someone famous for deceptive purposes, why choose Mark? Unless, of course, that's exactly who wrote it.
The four Gospels we have are forgeries and alterations from an earlier manuscript, which was destroyed and burned by the Roman Catholic Church. But it is mentioned by a late 1st century historian named Hegesippus, and it was called the Gospel of the Holy 12. And a Franciscan friar named Placidus actually found one remaining copy of this lost gospel, written in Aramaic in a Tibetan monastery in 1870. He translated it into Latin and presented it before the Catholic priesthood, who immediately seized it and buried it in the secret archives of the Vatican so that it would never see the light of day. And so the inconvenient truth is that the four Gospels we read today are not the original one, but only the highly edited and censored versions that the Roman Catholic Church wanted us to have.
I can't find any reference to this in Hegesippus, but what little we do have of Hegesippus is preserved for us by the 4th century historian Eusebius. And if Hegesippus was famous for anything, it was his identifying of heretical non-historical Gnostic works. So if Hegesippus mentions the Gospel of the Holy 12, it's to identify it as the counterfeit fake that it is. There is a writing referred to as the Gospel of the 12 mentioned by Origen in the 3rd century, but none of that particular document has survived. What is then described for us as the Gospel of the Holy 12, with its story of an Aramaic original discovered in a Tibetan monastery by a Franciscan friar, is a known and well-documented fabrication. It wasn't presented before the Catholic Church in the 19th century or buried in the Vatican archive, but first arose in a newspaper publication in the early 20th century. Now, no original was ever produced, only a translation, and over the years, many scholars have analyzed its text with no one thinking it gives any indication of any type of historical reliability whatsoever. The Gospel of the Holy 12 is a unanimously recognized forgery created by animal rights activists in the early 1900s to portray Jesus as a vegetarian. There's nothing within its contents that communicates any type of historical provenance nor accuracy to the time period of first century Israel that Jesus lived in. It is nothing more than a modern fake. Ironically, Aaron's accusation is backwards. The four biblical Gospels have unanimous origin in the first century, with a chain of custody regarding their authorship going right back to the earliest Jesus community. They are being written well within the living memory of the events described, either by eyewitnesses or by those who were sourcing from eyewitnesses themselves. The Gospel of the Holy 12, on the other hand, has no evidence of its existence prior to the 20th century, and its contents clearly outs it as a well-recognized, clear and evident modern forgery.